I would like to warmly welcome Jeffrey Tharsen and Clovis Gladstone from the University of Chicago. And Jeffrey Tharsen is a computational scientist for the digital humanities at the Research Computing Center there. And he received his doctorate from the University of Chicago and works in the field of pre-modern Chinese philology. So both Chinese philology and digital humanities, very exciting. And Clovis Gladstone is also kind of in between these two fields. He is a senior research associate and associate director of the ARTFL, which is a project for American and French research on the treasury of the French language, and currently working on a book project using digital methods to reinvestigate Rousseau's work. And so he's again demonstrating that the fruitful combination of traditional approaches and digital humanities, and they'll be presenting a tool called TextPAIR, which is a sequence aligner, but I'll leave it to you to explain it in more detail. So thank you very much for joining us today. I stop sharing and you can share your slides now.
Thank you for that very kind introduction. That's wonderful. Clovis and I are going to try and do this quickly, and I'll go ahead and start sharing my screen so we can get started. It's worth saying, first of all, we want to thank the organizers of this wonderful conference, especially Harvard, Göttingen, and Bucknell for inviting us. What we're going to be discussing is a project and a tool that works for many, many different languages. And I'm going to try and delve a little bit into our work on pre-modern Chinese historiography for you in a bit of a live demo, if we can get that to work later. So without further ado, Clovis, I'll hand it off to you to kick it off, if that works.
Okay, thank you, Jeff. So, what we're going to be talking about today is the evolution of a software that we designed already some time ago, rather like 6 years ago, which is designed to detect text reuses in large collections of text. Now, why are we interested in text reuse? Well, we know that intertextuality is a crucial element of humanistic research. We know that relationships between text are very complicated, multifaceted, and that a key element of humanistic understanding is to trace links between texts at all levels across time, from directly attributed quotations to influences and allusions. And the software that we're using, called TextPAIR, is really designed to find quotations. So it's not really looking at influences or allusions. This would be a natural evolution of the software. We're actually working on this. But what we'll be talking about today is actually reuses of passages in one text in a later text. So one of the primary goals or approaches to uncovering intertextuality is sequence alignment, which is a technique to identify regions of similarity shared by two texts. It is built using an approach from the bioinformatics for the detection of similar DNA sequences. So TextPAIR was designed to work on large-scale collections. So the algorithm that drives it was chosen for its lack of computational complexity. So it should run, or it runs fast, because when we're loading, so we've had a success running it on collections of over 100,000 texts. Now, the model of the way texts are represented within the aligner, texts are represented as a shingles of n-grams. That is to say, each document is converted into a format which facilitates the detection of reuses. It is highly parallelized, and it works for any language or script in Unicode. So we've released a lot of different databases in English, French, Japanese, German, Russian, Italian, and of course, Chinese. So here's an example of the output that you would get from the web interface of a TextPAIR. So in this case, what we're seeing here is a reuse here. So these are collections in English. a reuse of John Locke in Berkeley. And you can see in blue, those are the reuses. And you can see from the different color schemes, so green on the left side are words that have been modified in the reuse on the right-hand side. And when you see in dark blue on the right-hand side are additions from the original. Now, the software works really well. And in fact, almost too well for our own good when we're running it against large collections of text. So in this case, we're looking at a comparison of two different corpora, one looking at 15th, 16th, 17th century English to 18th century English collections. So over 30,000 texts in all. And when you're looking for, reuses of a particular author, for instance, here, John Locke, you get 5,000 results, which makes it hard to understand, to get a good sense of how a particular author is used when you have to scroll down over 5,000 results. Now, the problem could get even worse with some other authors, such as Shakespeare. In this case, for this particular example, we have over 40,000 reuses. And looking at the 24 histories, the problem gets even worse. Now we're facing 5 million reuses. How do you make sense of this? What are the patterns in the reuses across this collection? And of course, we've tried to use faceted browsing, when you see the frequencies on the right-hand side, which tells you, okay, this work was a source for 725,000 passages. That helps to some extent, but it's still 700,000 passages that you need to analyze and try to deduce or come up with a general pattern of reuse. So how can users navigate this wealth of data in an informed way? Could we imagine constructing networks of reuses, such as would be the case among works and authors sharing similar sources and ideas? And so this is how we came to think about, could you use visualization techniques from the web to actually help us in this attempt. Jeff?
So what we found is that if you try and do things in what's essentially a chord diagram, I'll skip back a slide rail here, you run out of pixels. You basically run out of the ability to show the complexity of the sources themselves and the intertextuality between them. And so we then moved into network analyses and found that this was a far better method for analyzing the way that nodes within a force-directed graph can show influence, and you can have communities of reuse then very easily detected. So the Chinese histories that Clovis was talking about, what I'm going to show you is one of our more refined versions of it, and it's 322,000 reuses throughout the 24 histories, all within a very simple network graph. And that it only has 24 nodes because it's work to work. But there are limitations with that. When you do this for other sources that we've used, here is the Encyclopédie by Diderot, and this has 7,000 reuses. And you can see how when you have a much larger network, you can really start to see these communities come to the fore. For example, this is a cluster representing the jurisprudence section of the Encyclopédie and where the sources for that section came from. Within French literature, we have very large corpora, and then we've been able to also pursue almost the same technique where we have these clusters of influence. And you could even argue that this is essentially a cluster of intellectual history, not just of text reuse. But what happens when you get to 5 million, right? What happens when you get to very, very large networks? And that's what we're trying to solve at this point. So further dimensionality reduction is really going to be the key. We have a bunch of interactive networks here. I'm just going to leave these up for a second so that others can explore them if they like. Those were in French and English. We have one for the Azor Bunko in Japanese. And then the big ones right now for the Chinese corpora are these 24 Chinese histories. And what happens with the 24 Chinese histories when you split by juan, by chapter, if you will, you start to see communities, clusters of influence, basically, where each of these large circles represents one of the histories and all of the sources that went into it. And so at this point, being mindful of time if I can, I just want to jump in very quickly to the software itself. This is the TextPAIR software. And if you run it essentially wide open on the histories, this is our curated 322,916 results from those 24 histories. And you can, of course, get to this if you would like through the network graph that we've presented here. So if I'm interested, let's say, in the Hanshu, I can click on it and I can see the Hanshu itself was the source of, in our alignment, 680 passages in the Sangoju, or for any of the other histories. I can just scroll down here. And of course, the only source that goes into the Hanshu is the Shiji. And yet we can pull that up immediately, and it shows us the 3,933 results between the Shiji and the Hanshu. And you'll notice some of these are spurious. Some of these are actually not very interesting. But if you go to the longer passage lengths, let's grab this one. What you can really start to see in these longer passages, when you go down, pardon my scrolling, this one's quite long, and you click Show Differences, it shows you the difference between what Sima Qian, assuming this was Sima Qian's work, presented in the Shiji and what Bangu has in the Hanshu. And we have essentially the same text here. I can try and make it a little larger so you can read it. But you can see a character by character analysis of the changes between the Shiji and the Hanshu. And that gives us both the ability to detect essentially the editorial hand of Bangu, but also intellectual traditions as they changed, or even just cultural ideas. So why was Bangu changing the work from Sima Qian? As you can see, the overlap is considerable. We're at almost 95% overlap here. And yet many of the subtle differences are illuminative, where he's just taken out an entire section here of the text, right? Why did Bangu do this? This is a wonderful question. And I do want to give a real nod to the folks in Chinese history who have worked on this for, at this point, many hundreds of years. They're way ahead of us in terms of understanding why. But what we can do is algorithmically detect these changes from work to work in any corpus of any size at the character level, and then visualize it either within a smaller network like this, or within the larger network. And I'm going to go ahead as my last thing here and try to run the most recent Zhuan-based network visualization. And this is going to take a second to load. And this is where we start to see our limitations. And as we were talking about a bit ago, what we really need to do is figure out a way to pre-build this network. This is a very, very large network. And then so that the end side, and because I'm running Zoom, it's actually running a bit slow, I apologize. So that the end user is not sitting here waiting when they're trying to explore the network. And let's see if it still hasn't come up. So I think because of the lag with Zoom, it's going to take a bit. Here we go. So you can start to see this is now Zhuan to Zhuan, all of the differences between the 24 Chinese histories. And I'm going to zoom way out if I can. I tend to use a mouse with a scroll wheel. And you'll start to see the extraordinary complexity of these networks. And what happens now is we have a force direction algorithm running on it. I zoomed out a bit far, but you'll start to see the networks pull apart into that screenshot that I gave you earlier. And what you start to then be able to detect, of course, are these clusters of intellectual traditions based around the various works within historiography over 2,000 years of Chinese history. I do want to highlight that you can do this, of course, for Chinese history, but you can do it for any of the corpora that we have. So you can do it for literature, you can do it for pretty much anything that you have within Unicode. So in conclusion, the original idea here was, what do we do with all of this data, right? We have so much now that we can train our algorithms to try to identify for us. What do we do to make it easier on the scholars who would like to explore these networks of reuse? What can we do in terms of making it on demand, essentially, so that if you had a specific work that you were interested in, you could drop it into the system, click a button, and see all of the potential sources for that work. And this would be, I would think, available, driven by all of our corpora. So any work in English, any work in Chinese, any work in any language. And that's really where we're hoping to go with this.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Jeff, and thank you very much, Clovis, for this wonderful presentation and this wonderful tool.